requirements of all the ways that displacements were being used, and they shipped in large sections of our game world. Looking back, displacements are a clear example of how technology and game design evolved together. It's a chicken and egg problem. We can't foresee all the ways a piece of tech will impact the game, but we also can't build a tech without knowing what it needs to accomplish. So, as is always the case, we have to build something. We start with a solid guess and see where it leads us.
Gestures. Each of our characters had a library of simple animations called gestures, which we could easily layer on top of other body movements. While originally planned as a production savings to allow us to reuse animations throughout the game, we found they actually had more utility than that. Humans often repeat certain movements, and these can be markers of a specific personality. As a result, our gestures library ended up capturing the essence of each character, helping to unify our animation team's understanding of who those characters were. This made it much easier for our animators to share any one character's workload among themselves, which production often required.
Airboat Changeup. We heard from the playtesters that they wanted more varied gameplay from the airboat. Up until this point of the game, the player had no real way to fight back against the helicopter and other enemies, so it felt right to introduce a new weapon and in turn deliver a pacing change and set the stage for what would come next. In the subsequent areas, we added target practice to acquaint people with their new weapon. Extra physics force on the airgun projectiles meant targets would get sent flying and make it feel way more powerful than anything in the player's loadout. Even then, when it came to playtesting combat against the helicopter, a lot of testers still thought it was invincible, and hadn't noticed our efforts to illustrate that it was taking damage from the Combine-mounted guns earlier. To get over this, we did the most obvious thing. We put the helicopter directly outside the tunnel in which you get the gun and make it extremely clear that you can and should shoot it. And it worked.
Skybox time of day. The skybox in fog color changes incrementally during this chapter. This is meant to visually represent the passage of time as the player journeys through the canals and the chapter.
Yeah, I don't think my laptop is like able to
help sell the illusion of the oblique angle of the sun.
take it because it's like
getting closer to sunset
this is like 5,000 times
This culminates in
5,000.
the helicopter combat arena with the sun setting and Ravenholm visible in the skybox.
A Half-Life game is an ultimately linear experience, but we're always looking for ways to break up the player path and create nonlinearity at level scale. This lambda cache, replaced with a zombie and headcrab ambush, was entirely optional and built only to add some of that nonlinearity to this section of travel through the canals.
Donkey Kong Barrel Ramp. This particular area, the drainage ramp, originally started as just an interesting piece of level architecture. But during playtesting, we quickly saw how fun it was to slide the airboat up and around the slope, so we added more elements to enhance that experience. This included Metro Cops dropping barrels down toward the player, and a little nod to the classic arcade game, Donkey Kong.
Helicopter Megabomb Origin. The Megabomb helicopter attack was based on a bug where a programmer accidentally removed the bomb drop cooldown, resulting in the chopper dropping hundreds of bombs all at once. It looked so cool that we decided that we had to keep it for the final shipping bombing run attack.
Arena Exit Gate. The wheel mechanism to raise the exit gate was added specifically to force the player to defeat the helicopter before they can move forward. We often refer to elements like this as gating the player, using design elements to keep them from progressing until they've completed a necessary task. Here, it's quite literally a gate.
Helicopter Final Battle. We designed this area as the arena for the final showdown between the player and the Combine attack helicopter. It's the player's chance to finally eliminate the relentless enemy that's been hunting them since fleeing underground after leaving Kleiner's lab. This area went through many iterations to get right. It needed ample space for fast-paced vehicle combat, a smooth movement flow with clear path options, and reliable performance. We also aimed for visual clarity suited to combat, striking but not overly noisy, while ensuring it would serve as a memorable vista once the helicopter is destroyed.
Airboat Wreckage.
Originally, we destroyed the airboat in the jump over the dam, so this level opened with the player amidst the wreckage of their beloved airboat. In a team-wide playtest, people felt disappointed to lose the vehicle they had spent so much time in. There was a lot of internal debate about whether that feeling of loss was a valuable experience or not. Ultimately, we decided to leave the airboat intact, to allow for the possibility of the player reuniting with it someday. Some say that airboat is still out there, waiting for you.
Wait, what is this a reference to?
In our early plans for Half-Life 2's narrative, we wanted to take on the challenge of doing something less explicitly game-focused. Not just a story.
Yeah, because it's been a while since I played Half-Life, to be honest. Hang on, it's getting hot in here. Fuck.
Focus on characters and their relationships. We thought it would be interesting to explore family as a central dynamic unit of Half-Life 2.
Oh, it's Alex and her dad. Okay.
Alright. Emerged from that idea, and we liked it.
Yeah, after Half-Life Alex, I really want to know where the series will go after that, because it's like, it's obvious that it's like they changed the timeline and shit.
Understanding of how to set up and design effective choreo scenes. As a result, we were able to create a more complex scenario with more opportunities for it to respond to the player. Having multiple characters doing their own thing around the room made staging tricky, and it took a lot of iteration and playtesting to get it to run smoothly. Our experience showed that, generally, players wanted to play along with the scene. They just needed enough subtle clues to know where we wanted them. Similarly, if they got distracted, the scene had to gently pause and wait for them to return.
We want to put this dense chunk of visual story here because it's the place the game is most explicit at telling players to explore a space. Even though its primary job is world building, we still take strides to
Man,
highlight
it's been a while since I
relationship
draw
between
about
Eli and
Siji, so
Bryn,
that's why it's him.
giving context to the world's central conflict.
Feel free to look around. Balancing the player's desire to explore with the narrative goals of the scene was always a challenge. We wanted the room to be full of interesting things to look at, but many players wouldn't explore until they were sure they wouldn't miss any of the character performances. That's why it was important for Eli to tell the player to look around midway through the scene. It signaled that it was safe to explore. From there, we could trigger a variety of custom mini-scenes based on what caught the player's interest.
Hugs and pickups. Sometimes even little things can be a nightmare to get working. For example, getting a character to hug another character, or even more simply, just to pick up an object from a table, can cause a lot of issues. Even worse, in our dynamic environment, where the characters and objects aren't in preset positions, and the player is running around getting in the way, these require a level of synchronization that can be quite tricky. They're made harder because humans handle them without thinking. As you're moving to the table to pick up a cup, you're doing all kinds of preparation with your body to get your feet and hands in the right position to be allowed to do it comfortably. Everything ready right when you get there. If you're moving in to hug somebody, you're both doing it at the same time, adjusting constantly based on each other's movement.
Man, what's going on
To get
here?
these features to work in the game involved a lot of synchronization work, making characters aware of each other and the world, and at the same time, getting them to know more about their future plans. It's tempting to want to break up, pick up a cup example into discrete steps. Walk to the table, face cup, pick up a cup, because it's much simpler that way, and it makes the steps nicely reusable. But that's how robots work, not humans. Our characters had to know they were moving to a table with the intention to pick up a cup, so they could work on multiple parts of it simultaneously, making sure their hand grabs the cup
simultaneously with a nene.
It's even more of a negotiation. Both need to agree where and when it's going to happen, and everything needs to happen in place in a seamless fashion. While these moments of simple interaction with their characters in the world are often short, they were critical to making them seem like believable people.
Mossman. Judith Mossman
Hang on,
was
what's going
originally
on?
based on a character we had planned for a section of Half-Life 1. That section was cut from the base game and reused in Uplink, but without the character. We consider her the most complex character in Half-Life 2. We knew we'd be walking a tightrope with how the player felt about her even before Nova Prospekt, because the player's trusted sources don't agree. Eli likes her, but Alex doesn't. We recognized there was a limit to how much complexity we could pull off in relationships, but we felt that a stepmother-daughter dynamic was something players would understand. Whether or not you agree with Mossman, she's doing something heroic. She risks being a double agent to get the information she needs to protect Eli and Alex. She just didn't plan for Gordon.
Character lighting. In the first year of development, we were struggling to get our characters to feel as realistic as we wanted them to. There were actually quite a number of different problems, all of which eventually required specific technological and artistic improvements to fix. The first major problem was lighting. At the time, lighting technology in games had many shortcuts, some due to performance, but many due to misunderstandings of how it all works. To make characters look good at the time, models and textures had to be created with much of their lighting solution baked into them, like shadows and glossiness. The characters looked cool, but they also looked like video game characters. We started building Alex with this approach, because that was how you were supposed to do it. We used the baked solutions and lit her like a movie actor, essentially as if she had a custom lighting rig that followed her around and ensured she always looked good. But it didn't really work. The range of lighting environments and the dynamic nature of video games meant that she'd look great in some environments, but always end up looking terribly unrealistic at some point. We tried iterating on our lighting rig, increasing its capabilities, but eventually it felt like we were at a dead end. Returning to the drawing board, we decided to try a different approach. We built her and the lighting and the textures from the ground up, throwing everything away, focusing on not on what we wanted her to look like in our ideal lighting, but on how things were supposed to work in the real world. It might seem obvious, but it wasn't how it was done, at least not in video games. When looked at outside the game's renderer, these models and textures actually looked worse than the previous versions, but we managed to methodically pull out all the shortcuts and misconceptions about how light and texture and graphics cards worked and put it all back together. After all that was done, when we were finally able to look at Alex in-game with her new models and textures in a dynamic environment that kept her visually consistent at all times, well, she looked great. Totally seamless and part of the Half-Life 2 world. Facial technology. We wanted players to care about our characters, and to even have a chance at achieving that, we knew we had to invest a lot of technology for our characters' faces. It's well understood that humans are wired to pay attention to faces, subconsciously reading all kinds of information from them, so it's an extremely high bar, and if we couldn't reach it, we'd probably push players away from our characters, not towards them as we hoped. We started out doing a lot of research. It was not heartening. The best examples we could find weren't anywhere near close to being able to be run in real time, while the best real-time ones weren't close to the quality we wanted. We wanted to look as good as an animated movie, but they often took hours to render frames and were totally linear, authored by up to 100 animators, whereas ours had to be dynamic. A character might be trying to speak dialogue or a facial move derived from a player's actions and created by just a handful of artists. These requirements eventually led us to Dr. Paul Ekman's facial acting coding system, a system for taxonomizing human facial movements done back in the 1970s. It gave us a vocabulary for describing facial movements throughout our tools and code, and a target to aim for when designing our characters' faces. With it as a framework, we started a many-year process of iterating on how we built faces and heads of our characters. Where others had tried taking bits of Ekman's work, we wanted to try to use it all. That meant a lot of time spent figuring out how to do each piece within the tight performance constraints we had. But we also spent a lot of time just looking at people and faces, trying to find the extra features that would add the most value, like skin elasticity, teeth shadowing. In the end, while we weren't able to do everything we wanted, we did manage to get the pieces we thought were the most important to a convincing facial performance level on our characters.
Try grabbing those barrels from that ledge.
Eye shader. Another critical part of getting character faces to be convincing was in the eyes. Humans are great at reading eyes. There's a part of your brain dedicated to it, down to knowing where somebody is looking based on the reflections on the eyeballs. But there are all kinds of subtleties that matter. Eyes aren't actually spheres. Eyelids get distorted by the cornea moving around underneath. Eye movement can increase the odds of blinking. Eyes don't actually line up directly behind the pupil. They're shifted slightly. All these little details might feel small or unnoticeable, but the absence hurts the believability of the character. We worked on eyes for a long time, iterating our eyeball model and feature set little by little. Some things required external interfaces, like what things in the environment were interesting to look at, where others were automatic, at a subconscious level in the AI, like blinking, an obvious requirement, but one that's subtly confusing if it's wrong. Eye reflections had a particularly large impact. They're ultimately a tiny amount of real estate on the screen, but the difference they made was enormous. We knew we were finally done when we reached the point where, with our eye shader off, a character looked like a doll, human-like, but unconvincing in some way that was hard to describe. But when we turned it on, suddenly it felt like a human was looking at us.
moving the gravity gun. When the gravity gun was first prototyped, we planned to give it to the player midway through the game. But as playtesting progressed, we saw the strength of its design and realized the gravity gun and, more importantly, the ability to launch saw blades at zombie faces needed to come earlier. That meant Eli's lab also needed to move earlier too. It was a significant change, but it was crucial to Half-Life 2's success. It serves as a good reminder that storytelling and gameplay are intertwined, and neither can always take priority. They have to work together.
Risk. Looking back on Half-Life 2 now, 20 years later, it's sobering to reflect on how terrifying it was throughout much of the development. Game development is hard. You never really get what you'd like to have, which is be able to validate risk before you start to pile more on top of it. For example, our facial animation technology, it took probably 3 or 4 years of work before we were confident it was actually going to work, but we couldn't wait until then. In that first year, we immediately started making all kinds of other choices in our game design, our asset production, and our other technologies, all based on the assumption that our facial animation technology was going to work in the end, from a quality and performance standpoint. If it hadn't, many of those other choices wouldn't have worked either. At the same risk profile is true of other large choices we made early on. We can't wait. We just have to build and hope that our guesses will be true years from now. Terrifying.
As we finished up our work on Ravenholm, we couldn't shake the feeling that the transition from Eli's lab just wasn't working. It was far too...
Hang on.
Terrifying.
As we finished up our work on Ravenholm, it was far too...
Hang on.
Terrifying.
Yeah.
Abrupt. Eli's lab connected directly to the streets of the town where you'll be shortly, and the section you're standing in didn't exist. We had just made this promise at the end of Eli's lab: we don't go there anymore. And we liked the overall build-up we'd created, but when the player got to Ravenholm, they were immediately dropped into combat with zombies without any room for tension building. So we built this section and the subsequent tight corridors to address that in a way we were happy with. We slowed the pacing, focused on art and lighting, and got you ready to experience why we don't go to Ravenholm anymore.
Ravenholm Gameplay Focus. After watching many playtests of Ravenholm, we knew the core gameplay of the level revolved around the gravity gun and physics. Once equipped with that knowledge, we felt we could appropriately build the transition into Ravenholm and help the player learn and understand a bit about what the upcoming experience would be. This happens often. We build the level track, figure out what's working, and then design its prologue. We built the following set of rooms with that table setting in mind. The brutality of the tools we provide the player seemed to aid in setting the mood we were striving for, helping to shift
yeah,
the
I really like this.
Eli's lab.
I really like this. What's it called?
Bringing physics to the enemies.
I really like this brush. It's not mine. I got it from somewhere online for free.
But they lacked player agency. It was the saw blades that helped us figure out what Ravenholm was truly about. With saw blades,
sorry if my voice is fucking raspy at the moment.
Instead of leading zombies into the physics. Once we had that understanding, Ravenholm evolved rapidly. We kept combing through the map, looking for anything, especially anything unusual, that could be turned into a tool or weapon for the player.
Player tools. By this point in the game, players have a lot of experience with Half-Life 2's physics, but they've just received the gravity gun, which provides a whole new way to interact with the physics objects in the game. We iterated on a variety of the physics objects that the player could play with, things like saw blades, the catapults, explosive canisters, traps, spears, and so on, and honed in on the ones that worked well with the physics gun and cut the ones that didn't. Then we went about stripping the levels of ammunition items so that the player had to rely on these objects to survive.
Contrived setups. There's a pretty obvious contrivance in a bunch of the gravity gun and physics object training. The player pulls a saw blade out of the wall with the gravity gun, and right on cue, a zombie stumbles around the corner, just begging to have a saw blade launched at it. Then the player crawls under a spinning blade trap to turn it off, and suddenly 3 zombies appear, taunting the player to switch the trap back on. We didn't have much time to iterate on this section, so we needed setups that worked for all players, not more open-ended ones that relied on them making the right move. While this kind of design has the potential to reduce players' creativity, in this case, we found that they didn't seem to mind that we forced their hand a little bit.
Paint cans. Once we started to succeed at making the gravity gun and physics gameplay the core of the Ravenholm experience, we started to go through the levels and look for objects that we might have overlooked as we were busy working with the really aggressive things like saw blades and exploding canisters. One of the things we found was the paint can, and it was simple enough for us to sort of reinforce player expectations by having the paint can splatter paint on the zombies when you threw one at them.
Ravenholm's development. We began developing Ravenholm early in the production of Half-Life 2, so it went through more than one full development pass. The first version predated the gravity gun, with gameplay focused on traditional zombie combat using guns and some of the physics traps. We even planned to showcase Ravenholm at E3 in 2002, but the game was ultimately unveiled a year later in 2003. By that point, we had invested heavily in Ravenholm's art, something which we generally avoid until the gameplay is fully proven. So once we went back to Ravenholm with the gravity gun mechanic in mind, we were working with a lot of pre-existing level geometry that had been designed with a very different gameplay goal in mind.
Misteaching flinches. Another memorable playtest and example of the danger of misteaching players occurred in Ravenholm. One of our design principles is for the game to respond to the player as much as possible. So when designing the gravity gun, it seemed obvious that if the player pointed it at a zombie and pulled the trigger, something should happen. It was simple enough to make it zap the zombie for a tiny amount of damage, causing the zombie to play its flinch animation, which felt good and responsive. Later, we watched a playtest where the tester discovered this interaction immediately upon arriving in Ravenholm, and interpreted it as a feedback that the gravity gun was hurting the zombie. Which it was, just not very much. So they zapped the zombie again, repeatedly, shocking it over and over until it died. This is a slow, unfun, inhumane way to fight zombies, especially where you're surrounded by saw blades and explosive canisters. Having learned our lesson, we removed that flinch animation, even though it meant losing that interaction between the zombie and the gravity gun. In this case, it was better to not have the simple interaction, rather than give the false impression that the gravity gun was an effective way to fight zombies. Even simple principles can require trade-offs when you get into the details.
Grigori Plaza. This open plaza is one of the areas that was fully detailed in our first development pass, and when we returned to it, we wanted to preserve as much of the existing art as possible while designing a new player path that used all 3 dimensions, moving players up and down, through windows, across rooftops, and between buildings. It wasn't a large space, so we had to squeeze as much track out of it as possible, and since that started as an art-focused area, it was light on gameplay and we needed to address that playtesters tended to fly right through it. And to top that off, it was already pushing our rendering performance budget with little room left for anything new. The challenge became finding small additions to slow the player down by adding threats around corners and into every nook and cranny of the level.
Hallway cupboards. These junk-filled hallways were a simple solution to our need to slow the player down. With the constraint of preserving as much of the existing geometry as possible, combined with slow-moving zombies as the main enemy, it was tricky to stop players from just sprinting through here. Luckily, having Grigori as the crazed inhabitant of Ravenholm made these setups easy to justify. It makes good sense that he'd clog the stairwell to keep himself safe on the rooftops. In the end, Grigori's solution and ours were one and the same. Just throw a bunch of furniture in the way, because if it stops zombies, it'll probably slow the player down too.
Even with all the work we did to try and make a connection between this lever and the outside electric fence in the players' minds, some testers would still flip the lever and not know what they'd done. They'd even wander around, flip the lever back on, and wander around some more. With not much time to spend on making the connection clearer, we elected to just have the lever break off. This prevented players from undoing their progress and added to the feeling that Ravenholm was an unreliable and decaying environment.
Poison headcrabs.
This room unintentionally introduces poison headcrabs. We'd spent a lot of time crafting their proper introduction later in the level, but once we saw how well they were playtesting, our excitement got the better of us, and before too long we'd scattered them throughout the level. By the time we realized they'd appeared before their intro, it was really too late to rework it. Fortunately, a tight room of poison headcrabs works as decent training, because their design avoids a common issue with combat training. Typically, players are stressed and they can get frustrated if they die repeatedly without understanding why. And sure enough, We encountered that problem when trying to train the player with both poison headcrabs and their source, the poison zombie. However, poison headcrabs can't kill the player by themselves, so while stressful, a room full of them at least avoids that frustration.
Fire trap. This fire trap was originally intended as a visual showpiece for the fire system before a level designer repurposed it as a gameplay element for Ravenholm. It was almost cut many times during development due to the performance impact on the low-end PCs because of all the overdraw involved with the transparent sprites. In the end, there was a programmer who felt that it was important enough to the gameplay that it was worth doing the work to solve the performance issues and make sure we could get it into the game.
We all went to Ravenholm. When fans talk to us about Half-Life 2, Ravenholm is often the most remembered section. Thanks to its multiple development passes and the density of the material in it, more members of the team are represented in Ravenholm than anywhere else. It was where we figured out how to apply our artistic pipeline to the set pieces and mood we wanted, how physics and gameplay combined with the gravity gun, how headcrabs and zombies need to evolve for Half-Life 2, and much more. Looking back on it now, it reassures our belief in individual empowerment over centralized design. Ravenholm is dense, highly efficient in its gameplay and artistic execution, and the sum of many small contributions by individuals who understood how they could push it just a little further with their own unique capabilities.
Car crushers. These car crushers required some adjustments and quite a bit of work to our physics damage system. There's always a challenge when big physics objects interact with non-player characters. For instance, if the physics can push the NPC, it might shove them somewhere they're not supposed to go, leaving them unable to recover. This isn't a big issue for something like a headcrab, which can just hop out of a tricky situation, but for something like a zombie, it could mean they get stuck and end up helpless, flailing away in whatever gap they manage to wedge themselves into, which kind of kills the survival horror mood we're going for here.
Car crusher lifts. Getting the car crushers to lift the player was also tricky. See, the player is always being simulated by both the physics system and the game's movement system. Each time we update the player's state, we compare the results from both systems and decide which one is right, then sync them up and repeat. This allows the two systems to influence each other. Like when the player stands on a seesaw, the physics lets the board give way, or when they stand on the car crusher, it lifts them up. While more complex, this dual system approach was easier to tune than trying to handle both physics and player movement in a single system. By keeping them separate, we could fine-tune the player movement system to feel good on its own, only reconciling the two when physics was affecting the player.
Pacing switch. Now that the player's through the training section, we can start shifting the pacing from moody, claustrophobic spaces to more combat-focused action arenas. With the player familiar with the various physics tools in the environment, we can start mixing those into open spaces and just give the player the freedom to choose their approach.
Tables and bodies. Towards the end of Ravenholm's production, with all the major pieces in place, we went through and tried to fill out every bit of empty space with something interesting. In doing so, we had to be careful to use what we already had and not create anything new, as we couldn't risk introducing more bugs. Often, as in this room, we were trying to add new moments of gameplay, while also adding more detail and storytelling to the area. Small scenes like this allow an attentive player to think about what they're seeing and what it might mean for what they'll encounter next.
Fast Zombie Introduction. This space was another area originally built for E3 2003, where it showcased the player fighting against a squad of Combine soldiers. When we returned to use it to introduce the Fast Zombie, we tried to keep as much of the previous work as possible. We wanted an iconic moonlit shot with zombies leaping past the moon like werewolves to draw the player's eye. Once that beat is over, we introduce the first Fast Zombie to the player space and send it at them. It took a lot of iteration to find the right balance of lighting for the scene to look good, while ensuring it also worked for the gameplay goals.
Physics object consistency.
Alright, I gotta go. Thanks for those who are watching. Stay tuned for the other streams. Bye. Bye.